This is Committable. I'm Jesse Mangan, and I'm here with Leah Harris, and we are working together on a series that covers assisted outpatient treatment throughout the United States. Leah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse. I am Leah Harris. I am a second generation psychiatric survivor, and that informs everything I do as a journalist, as an activist, as a person yelling in various rooms and spaces about forced treatment.
And I've been through involuntary hospitalizations and a civil commitment, and all of my experiences were in Massachusetts, and that is how I was introduced into this broader issue of assisted outpatient treatment. So to start, why don't we give people a little introduction and discuss what is assisted outpatient treatment?
Absolutely. So I think language is really, really important. So I always preface any discussion of assisted outpatient treatment to say that this is branding. Right. This is branding that was used to sell a regime of force and coercion. So originally, when this concept was floated in the 1980s, it had a much more honest name, right, of involuntary outpatient commitment, right, as opposed to involuntary inpatient commitment. And the whole idea is simply to vastly expand the amount of people who are eligible for coercive programs. So, what is called AOT really is a layer of civil courts, right? So, this is distinct from the criminal legal system, but it is a regime of civil courts that are established in these states, right, for the express purpose of compelling people who, again, I'm an abolitionist, so I don't want anyone to be locked up, but in this case, people who have not committed a crime based on some kind of predictive, subjective sense that they will not accept treatment voluntarily, and a whole other host of criteria that we could get into. But basically, the entire purpose of it is to expand the groups of people who can be placed under coercive programs and court orders.
One of the things I think that is presented a lot in favor of this argument is that it is a civil process and not a criminal process. And I think what can get lost in that dialogue is that a civil process has fewer protections. And so due process protections are easier to blur in a civil process. So when you're talking about creating a new court system, which is what assisted outpatient treatment or involuntary outpatient commitment law does, it creates a new civil court system. You have to really think in depth about the sort of ramifications of the people being pulled into that system, what a court order means, because that's what this is. This is a court order that in theory connects to some sort of services or implementation. And so now that we have a sort of brief overview of what is assisted outpatient treatment, it's a form of court order that is in theory supposed to help people connect with services. Why would Massachusetts and Connecticut be important places to look at in regards to how these policies are implemented throughout the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we trace the history, 1999 was the first law that was passed in New York, also known as Kendra's Law. And so we've seen since 1999, there's been a concerted strategy to push these laws through. Most recently in 2024, Maryland was the 48th state, right?
Right.
And the District of Columbia. Yeah. So we have these laws that have existed since 1999 and onward in various states. And we just haven't actually seen them be used widely, first of all, because the assumption is we are compelling people into services that exist. And in most cases, they don't, right? And we could go into all of the reasons why that is. But yeah, our system is profoundly underfunded. Often these laws, when they are used, they're used very punitively against overwhelmingly Black and brown people. When they are used, it's overwhelmingly medication and medication management, not really any kind of robust array of services. Certainly in some cases, that has been the case. And it's been proven that the court order adds nothing to it. So it's really just the availability of services that supported whatever outcomes they're measuring, right? So I think looking at these final two states, there is an argument that's being advanced, and it was also advanced in Maryland, like, oh, look, all these other states have this, like, we're behind. We need to modernize and catch up to the rest of the country without really talking about, well, what has happened in the rest of the country since these laws have been pushed through the vast majority of US states.
I think you identified a core question, which is if you cannot prove that the court order in and of itself is beneficial, then the only value is theoretically the services that you say the court is required to connect a person to. If those services don't exist and all you have is a court order, then what has been accomplished? Or if it really is about the services, then just fund the services instead of funding courts. This element of it was always bizarre to me because coming from Massachusetts, I was always grateful there was no outpatient commitment law because I was sort of going through these hospitalizations in this experience where everyone around me just assumed this is who I'm going to be now. I'm going to be the person that occasionally gets hospitalized and comes back out and goes back in. And I had to escape that. I had to step away from that expectation, that community, and find some way to really take care of myself. An outpatient commitment, I believe, would have stopped me from having that opportunity. And it really comes down to that court order. And so as we look at these policies, as we look throughout the country, there is right now a bill before the Massachusetts legislature trying to introduce an assisted outpatient treatment or involuntary outpatient commitment law in Massachusetts. And we both attended or virtually attended a legislative hearing discussing this law. What were some of the arguments you heard that were trying to support the advancement of this bill?
Yeah, so overwhelmingly, it was affluent families that were in favor of it. They named that, they named their privilege, but several of the family members talked about already having guardianships over, I mean, we're talking about adults here, by the way, but these are people who have the highest level of control over their adult loved ones in the form of Rogers orders, guardianships, and still they feel this is not enough to force their loved one. And they were very clear that it was mostly about forcing their loved one on medication, right? Because these are wealthy families. Like they can pay for housing, they could probably pay for services out of pocket. Right. So, yeah, it's overwhelmingly about forcing their adult children on medication. Right. And that just came across so clearly. And I also, I'm not like a monster. I hear, the struggle that families have. I'm also a family member. Both of my parents are deceased at this point in time, which I think is due to them being forced on treatment, at least in part. But I'm also a family member, right? So it's not like families versus people with lived experience or disabled folks, right? It's really about an orientation towards force and coercion, right? So that's really overwhelmingly what I heard. And again, the vast majority of these folks were white. And what we know, and the research is so clear that everywhere where AOT laws are passed, so-called AOT laws, it's overwhelmingly Black and brown folks who are being, put under these controlling court orders. So it's just, there's such a sort of, they're just divorced from the reality of implementation in other states and continue to sort of push the same line that this is the thing that's going to force my loved one on meds without ever asking, well, maybe why is my loved one resisting these medications? It's all chalked up to anosognosia, which we can talk about now or later.
Yeah, I think anosognosia has to be its own separate episode. But I think what I heard was some really tragic stories that I really sympathize with. But I think there is an idea that is separate from the policy. And this is one of the concerns that I have with these sorts of policies is when I read this legislation, I'm reading it from a point of survival. I need to know what I or someone like me would have to do to survive this sort of policy implementation. And I think the way it's presented to some of the people who truly have tragic stories and are desperate, it's presented to them as a concept more than a policy. This thing, it seems like, this is how it's presented, this thing will save your loved one. I heard more than once someone saying, my child is right now in and out of hospitals. I have a guardianship. I have a Rogers order, which in Massachusetts is an order to force medication. I have every legal mechanism to control their autonomy. But if I just had this one more thing, my loved one would get a job. They'd go back to school. And I don't know exactly how that's happening, that sort of translation to this concept divorced from the actual implementation of the policy. But that seems like where a lot of it's coming down to, is that if we were to argue policy, we're taking hope away from someone. And I don't want to do that. I don't have a thing to replace it with, but I also, not only have I been through that system, I've been in that system with other people. And so when I read this law, I think about the people that I've been in the systems with. I think about the people who have been harmed by this sort of coercion. And I see myself in the people being targeted. And I think family members see their loved one in the people being targeted by this policy. And I don't think that has to be a rift, but that is the ultimate sort of reality that gets presented a lot of the time, is that if you see yourself as the person being targeted, you're on the other side. And there are some really sort of extreme allegations about, if you don't support this policy, you want to abandon people to death, which I promise you, those are the people I was in the hospital with. That is me that you're talking about in terms of abandoning. That's not something I'm ever going to support or present to anyone else.
Precisely, right. There's just, it's like an ideology that is being sold to desperate families. And there are solutions, and I think there's just an unwillingness to look at any other solution, because I think that the PR and the campaigning has been so effective over so many years to convince people of something that is truly smoke and mirrors. Really, the closer you look at it, the more it falls apart.
And I think a truly honest conversation requires saying to grieving people in serious pain, you have to say to them, nothing is a guarantee. There are no guarantees with this. There are situations where people are struggling with something that we can't understand, and we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. We don't know that we can guarantee any positive outcome. We can try, and that is the only promise that you can really give. And I think anyone who tells you they have a guarantee in mental health policy is someone who you should run away from.
Correct. Yeah, because in that case, it's a sales pitch. Right. So I do empathize. And at the same time, it's just there's a profound sense of entitlement in trying to promote a policy that will harm many people on a unspecified possibility. Like you said, there's no guarantees that it might help your loved one in the future. And then the other thing I just would say to all of this is, very rarely do people become the way they are overnight, right? Folks have been in systems a long time, have been subjected to all kinds of terrible treatment of various kinds, and no one ever asks, why now are you resisting, right? So there's just never that curiosity. And that's one of the things I find so frustrating.
I think for anyone who hasn't been enmeshed in this, everything we just said is probably a lot. It's a lot to try to present this concept. It's a lot to try to dig into the research, because research conversations should be specific. So I think with this series, what we're doing, to begin, we're going to look at Massachusetts more specifically. What is the proposal there? We're going to talk to people to help break that down with us. And then we're going to look at Kendra's law in New York that is usually presented as a shining example. And consistently, Kendra's law, the Assisted Outpatient Treatment law in New York, the average age of people on that is about 39. It is exponentially, disproportionately used on people of color. And the research, there was more and more coming forward, even related to a comptroller audit from last year, showing that they have never appropriately tracked the information needed to determine whether or not this policy is effective. And so to start, we're going to look at Massachusetts, then we're going to look at New York, and we're going to get into some of these conversations. And this is such a complicated issue in some ways because you are really dealing with ideology, really powerful ideology, and you're dealing with that promise of hope. And we're never going to get to that place we need to get. We're never going to get to a place where we can say to someone, we can try everything before a crisis happens. We're never going to get to that point if we endlessly fight about these sorts of policies that are not driven by evidence and are not proven to help.
Yeah, it is some really depressing stuff as someone who kind of got involved in this work about a year or two after Kendra's law passed, right? I've seen that phenomenon of we're just arguing in circles over decades and things get worse. And I think, this is again a broader conversation, but I think it's important to look at the structural barriers, right, on a more macro level, right, to having the kinds of systems and supports that people want and that actually do help.
And we will get into all of that. So, Leah, thank you for joining me for the start of this series, and we will keep updating as we go.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jesse. Excited to get into this depressing topic.
I promise every once in a while we'll cover something like a peer respite, which is a really inspiring alternative, which can work for a lot of people. So as much as there is some doom and gloom in this, we'll try to introduce some other more hopeful alternatives too.
Yeah, and snarky, sarcastic commentary as needed.
Sarcasm is a survival mechanism. Like, you have to sometimes.
Yes, indeed.